Well, welcome to all of you. I'm glad you're here. It's wonderful to see you. I'm delighted to be here to introduce Chesea Conaboy, who writes about Boston's medical history, state and national healthcare policy, and advancements in medical research for the White Coat Notes blog on boston.com and for the Boston Globe. And I told Chesea I was just going to get up here and say Chesea's wonderful and sit down. But I'll say a couple more things. Chesea was my advisee some years ago, and what I remember most about Chesea is her drive and her talent, and I think we all knew she was going to go off and do good work. When I was getting ready for her visit, I went to her website, and I found on it at that time a statement that says something about how important journalism is. And the statement was, deepening our understanding of our neighbors, their triumphs and struggles, their untold histories, makes us all more compassionate, relieves our collective hardship, and inspires. And I think that says a lot about what makes Chesea such an amazing journalist. So, Chesea Conaboy.
Well, first, just thank you all so much for this week. It's really been a great couple of days. I've had such a fun time talking with students one-on-one and with the TNH staff and in classes. It's really just been a great time for me to kind of reflect on what this job is and where I've come from since I've sat in your seats, and also where I think you all are going. And it's exciting. So thank you to Lisa and the rest of the department for inviting me to be here. It's really an honor. Well, I didn't ever know Don Murray directly. I never, obviously never had it in class or didn't sort of have a mentee relationship with him. I consider myself very much a student of his students. Obviously here at UNH and then at Poynter and in my professional life, his influence has really been a constant for me. So anything with his name attached to it really carries a lot of weight for me. So I'm accepting this role implied that I have something to say, that I have something to impart upon this group, which includes so many of my teachers. And frankly, I had a really hard time figuring out what that was. That's partly because I am very much in the early stages of my own career and trying to find my way in a fast-changing industry and really just a few steps ahead of all of the students here. I like to ask people when I meet them, about writers in particular, about how they got from there to here, how their career path unfolded. It's encouraging to me to hear how the pieces fit together, to see that sometimes missteps lead to launching pads, and times when they think they're in sort of a long plateau was just kind of like a resting period, before the next peak, the next big opportunity. Sometimes, though, when I hear these stories from longtime journalists about how they spent decades doing strong work for a mid-sized paper in a community that they loved, or how they climbed up the newspaper ladder from small to big and wound up at a major metro or working abroad, I am left feeling more unsettled than I am inspired. Many of the career paths that our mentors and our teachers took are gone. And that's just the truth. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this point. On how things have changed, how newspapers aren't what they used to be, or how readership is plummeting, which I don't believe. I think that's not true. I don't really want this to be a speech about how we're going to right the ship together. I get kind of tired of those conversations, and I'm going to bet that some of you do too. My point is just that while journalism has really always been a challenging and often winding career path, Young journalists today have to be more prepared than ever to find their own way. The well-worn routes are fading. The truth is that this is exciting. What's more exciting than starting on an adventure and not knowing where it's going to take you? But it's scary too. At this point, we really can't answer the question, where are you going? We don't know what things are going to be like years from now. So I suggest that we ask it in a different way. What are you fighting for? And I really mean that question. What are you fighting for? Why have you picked this field? What will keep you going when you are faced with uncertainty, anxiety about what lies ahead, choices about which direction to take? What are you fighting for? I think the answer to that can help us to find our bearing. So I thought I'd talk a bit about what I've found worth fighting for during the 10 years since I first worked in a professional newsroom. I had an internship between my sophomore and junior years at the Lewiston Sun-Journal, and I remember being terrified pretty much every day. But it was a great experience. I wrote about all the things a summer intern should, every summer festival that the city had. 4th of July, the Hot Air Balloon Festival, the Festival de Joie, which is the city's French-Canadian celebration. I profiled the local head of the Salvation Army. I hid behind a tree with a veteran photographer at a campground where they thought there was a gunman on the loose. I wrote about the restoration of the beautiful St. Peter and Paul Basilica, whose spires you can see from the highway when you drive by Lewiston. It was 2002, and Lewiston was going through a dramatic change. Somali refugees were settled through a government program in Portland and in big cities across the country had begun moving there by the hundreds. Drawn by available housing, good schools, and the chance to create a safer community for themselves. It was a big change for the overwhelmingly white post-industrial city. And that summer, I never wrote about the refugees. That was actually mostly done by another UNH alum, Lisa Chemelecki. But I had the chance to see up close the remarkable role that the Sun-Journal played in that city's evolution. The newspaper explained to long-time residents who the Somalis were, where they had come from, and what it took to get there. It answered the questions that were on a lot of readers' minds. What would the influx, more than 1,000 people in 18 months, mean for the city? Could the schools handle it? What about social services? It gave readers a space on the opinion pages to work out differences that they had, to say, this is who we are, and this is who we should be. At least 3,000 Somalis now live in the city, accounting for nearly 10% of Lewiston's population. By some estimates, the number is twice that. Somali-run stores are a fixture downtown, and last year, Somalis, for the first time, ran for public office. Reporters play a lot of roles in a community like Lewiston, including being the keepers of record and holding accountable the people who control the political process and the purse strings. My experience helped me to begin to see the role that I perhaps most identified with. At a basic level, journalists should introduce neighbors to each other. They should help us to know one another, because we can't really decide who we want to be as a community until we know who we are now. After college, I got a job at the Concord Monitor, where I covered many beats, including City Hall and the environment and the refugee community in Concord. The Monitor is a really unique place that gives reporters and photographers there a lot of latitude to just really figure out what works for them. The city editor, Hans Schultz, has this, he puts a lot of faith into his young reporters, and he has this way of believing in them, but not telling them that up front. Within my first couple of years there, with his encouragement, I had discovered my love of narrative writing, of conveying to readers what writer and teacher Tom French calls the felt experience. Not just asking people about what happened, but being there when it happens. I remember distinctly how I felt the first day I sat with Carolyn St. Pierre and her husband Rich at the kitchen table in their Concord home in the spring of 2006. And my apologies to those of you who have heard this a few times at this point this week, but a friend of Carolyn's had introduced me to the couple, and they started to tell me their story. They talked about how they had met just a few years earlier on a blind date and fallen in love. About a year into the courtship, Carolyn, who had 2 children from a previous marriage, Brian and Melissa, found out that she was pregnant with a 3rd. Elijah was born in July 2002. Nearly 2 years later, after months of pain in her shoulder and in her chest and a nagging cough that puzzled doctors and left Carolyn with a feeling that something just wasn't right, she finally was diagnosed with a rare liver cancer. The prognosis was bad. Days before she was scheduled for a complicated surgery that would remove a large portion of her liver, and one that doctors said that was risky and for which doctors really weren't sure it would work. Rich and Carolyn married in their backyard. In sickness and in health, Carolyn said as she told me about that day. It was so real. Carolyn knew that a cure was unlikely. She was fighting for as much time as she could get with her children. Excuse me. And she had a worthy ally in Rich who had, lost his own mother when he was a young boy and really didn't remember her. And he was just willing to do whatever he could possible to make sure that his own son had memories that he never had. That included allowing photographer Preston Ganaway and I to follow the family through their journey. From the start, I really felt that I knew that this was a special story. I knew because of how I felt when I was around them, because of how strong their love was and how eloquently they spoke about what they were going through. And because they opened up to us right away, which to journalists is just a true gift. But there were times when others would ask what I was working on when I found it really hard to explain. Carolyn was not a famous person. Her family was not remarkable in ways that typically make the news industry take note. There was absolutely no news hook in their tale. Family faces cancer. What was remarkable was the courage that Carolyn and Rich and their extended family showed in lifting the curtain on their life. Preston and I spent time with them at the hospital during birthdays and holiday celebrations. We were there when Carolyn came home from the hospital for the last time, when she and Rich sorted through photos that would be shown at her wake, on the long nights that her family kept vigil as she lay awake or asleep in a hospital bed set up in the guest room of her home. Sometimes she would sleep for hours while her family members told stories. Other times she held court there with her wry humor as sharp as ever. We were there the day she died, and with her permission, we followed her family for about 10 months afterward as they struggled to find their way without her. The story was published in 5 parts over the course of about a year and a half. The reaction was overwhelming, and more so when Preston was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for feature photography in 2008. People from all over the world began emailing, saying they were touched by the story, thanking Rich and his family for their openness. And many of these people were folks who had lost loved ones or who were in the process of losing them. One woman wrote that she had never purchased the Concord Monitor before the day the paper reran portions of the Remember Me stories. She picked it up by chance, looking for reading material in a few hours she had to waste. The day before, she had learned that her mother, who was sick with lung cancer, was being moved to hospice care. Over the last 24 hours, she wrote, "I have struggled with how to perceive this reality that the end is nearing. I never would have known that buying a newspaper would create such a sense of peace for me in this regard." I left the Concord Monitor in late 2009 for the Philadelphia Inquirer, where I eventually became a health reporter. In early 2011, I was helping with coverage of a grisly case there. A doctor who offered abortion services was charged with 8 counts of murder. One for a woman who died in his care, and another 7 for babies the prosecutor said he delivered live and then killed. According to the grand jury report on the case, which laid out the allegations in gruesome detail, state regulators had long ignored signs of trouble at this facility, including a history of injured patients. I spent an afternoon walking around the mostly poor neighborhood where he had lived and worked. And this is the accused doctor. I was looking for people who knew him, who could start to explain how a man who was once respected as a community organizer who had brought healthcare to an underserved part of the city could be accused of such crimes. Nearly every woman I spoke to had a story. They had been treated by Kermit Gosnell or had a close family or a friend who had. Nearly all had a tale of a woman they knew who had been sickened after a procedure he had performed. One young woman told me she had been hospitalized for more than a week from infection. She had gone to him because she trusted him, she said, because he was a neighbor. Many of the stories we tell are not uplifting. They are not reaffirming of the human spirit or of our ability to struggle for good or to cope with tragedy. But they make us look at ourselves and at our neighbors and to make choices. This is who we are. This is who we should be. These are the things that, to me, are worth fighting for. This is where I find my bearings, in serving a community of readers and helping us as people who live on the same block, in the same town, in the same state of affliction, helping us to know each other better so that collectively we can make better choices. In reaching that goal through story. For me, the fight mostly has been internal, about the choices I make as a reporter, about how I decide to think about my role, and how that thinking shapes my actions. I now write one of the Globe's healthcare blogs. It serves a really good purpose, covering Boston's dominant economy, the doctors and hospitals that make it one of the premier medical cities in the world. A colleague of mine made a joke recently while working on something expected to get a lot of hits on the website. And please excuse my language, but what this person said was loudly enough for me and for others to hear it, was, "We're such traffic whores." I'm sure the post had to do with sex or drugs or Justin Bieber, and the comment was a joke. It was a joke, but even as I sat there stoically, some little part of me, of my spirit, stood up on my desk and shook my fists and shouted, "I am not a traffic whore. I will learn about what drives traffic online. I will master search engine optimization. I have spent time and effort developing a social media following. I think hard about how to serve an audience of readers online and how to spread our good work to the most people. I do all of that with pleasure. But I will do it because I believe the stories that we tell are important and deserve attention. I will do it with mission in mind. Whether it's at the Globe, in my work as a freelancer, in the books I hope to write someday, and the work that will shape what I believe will be a long career as a writer, I will keep this as my bearing. And before I stop, I just want to say one other thing on a personal note. I just want to acknowledge my grandparents are in the audience, and I think I have gained a lot from them that has helped me professionally. My grandfather, Frank Conaboy, is a true storyteller, and my grandmother, who will turn 92 this year, I think that I get a lot of my natural curiosity from her, and I just want to tell one little story. We took a trip to New York City to celebrate her 90th birthday a couple of years back, and we went to a fancy show on Broadway, and we went out to dinner, and we stayed in a hotel on Times Square, and I woke up one night in the middle of the night, and I found her there with her head poked out the drapes. She'd sort of pinched them closed under her chin so that the light from the square wouldn't wake us. And at 90 years old, she wanted to see what did Times Square look like at 3 in the morning. And I just think that if my thirst for the world is what hers is for half the number of years, I will really be blessed. So I'm so glad that you're here. Thank you. Sue?
Chesea, what are the opportunities, what have you found are the opportunities for long narratives like you did at the Monitor and that, that was sort of the cornerstone of the Globe? What are those opportunities now online?
Well, so online I think that they're great, but first I should say, I kind of feel like when I was graduating that the kind of word was that those stories were dying, that the newspapers, and including, in addition to shrinking, their foreign staffs were cutting space for that kind of story. That there was this debate about, like, was that kind of storytelling dead? Did readers really want it? And I think one testament to the fact that that's not the case was that the Globe recently brought Tom French in to speak for a week, or a couple of days anyways, to staff, and last year invested in the Bus 19 project, which was a major sort of narrative series, and I know that they have more stuff in the works. So there's a place for it in traditional newspapers that people didn't think there would be at this point. But I think that there's a lot of room for it online. Literally, there's a lot of room for it online, but also there's a lot of interest in it. You look at Byliner or websites like that, or the curation sites like Longform or others, that are kind of really nurturing an audience for that kind of work. And I think it's going to keep growing. I'm excited about the future for that. So.
Any questions?
Probably answered them all.
You said that health reporting, that beat, wasn't what you had necessarily gone out into journalism looking for.
Yeah.
And what would you say in terms of like trying to find what you're passionate about in writing?
How do you do it?
Just kind of how that comes about.
Yeah. So you're right. I didn't start as a health reporter. Is that what you mean? That I did sort of stumble into it a little bit. But yes. So I think that one thing that if you don't know sort of where you want to specialize, I think that you should just get out and try to write for as about as diverse a group of beats as you can. Like especially if you can get to a community newspaper or for a news website that has you just covering a variety of topics, I think it's really useful. You know, when I started at the Globe, I mean at the Monitor, I was a regional reporter, which means I covered a bunch of towns. And so I was covering everything, cops and courts and local politics and features and farming and history projects that were going on in these towns. I mean, when you get into that sort of general assignment role, you get a chance to really cover a wide variety. And then just pay attention to what you're drawn to. I mean, looking back now, a lot of the bigger work that I did at the Monitor was healthcare focused, although I didn't really recognize it then. But that was something that I was naturally drawn to, those stories. And then the other point I would say is listen to the people who know you, who know you well, and look for mentors who can help you to figure that out. The reason why I ended up in healthcare really is because I had an editor at the Inquirer who I think saw potential in me and who I really loved working for. And he wasn't even my editor. He kind of ended up just pulling me in on things. And then eventually he hired me as a health reporter. So I think know yourself and like actively work to know yourself and work with your mentors to figure it out.
You've worked at both like smaller local papers and then obviously like larger city papers, and especially like with the time that you've been writing, sort of like as journalism gets more and more digital. How would you say that sort of like readership and responses that you get from readers with those different types of papers and also as things digitize, how is that different?
So when you're writing for what you could call a community newspaper, you know, a smaller newspaper, the reaction is really close to you. Like it could be in your inbox or on your voicemail, but you also live among the people that you're writing about. So that's a really interesting experience because, for one, you're like hyper accountable for what you do because really they're the people who know you. You know, it's a really cool thing. Like you pull up to the gas pump and you hear people talking about your story outside the gas station. Like that's really close. And at the Globe, I mean, or at the Inquirer, is this what you're asking about? Like this kind of reaction from readers? Yeah. At the Inquirer, I mean, I think everything's just bigger. You know, the audience, the actual readership numbers are so much bigger, and what you do on the front page of the Inquirer might make news on the nightly news. You know, like it's just it's sort of in a way like it's less personal, but it's bigger. Like there's a different kind of weight to it. And then digitally, I feel like that's a hard question to answer. The thing that I think is great about working sort of online first is that it's much easier to kind of like create more of a conversation with people than in either of the other roles. Like, so there are people that I know like read the blog all the time, and if I write about one topic, I'm going to hear from them either in the comments or in my email box, and you know, I can sort of use that because I'm writing a blog. I can like kind of use that to build it up in some ways. Like some of what I write about there is based on reaction I got, and you don't always have that sort of you don't have that flow. In the paper. In the paper, it's sort of like you flesh out a story and it goes in the paper and like that part is done and you might do another story, where on the blog, I feel like there's much more of a recognition that it's a constant conversation and a work in progress. So I don't know, there's less of a beginning and an end there. So I don't know if that answered your question, but.
What drew you to newspaper journalism as opposed to broadcast journalism? Because I know that like when people say journalist, it can be a very broad term for either or. And I know when I tell people that I want to be a journalist, they're like, oh, so you want to be on TV? And I'm
Yeah.
like, no, not at all.
I just never had an inclination to be a broadcast reporter. I mean, this is like really hard for me to get up and do this, so I think it would, I just wasn't in me to do that. But I also was really drawn to the writing process. I mean, that was important. And I know that there's a lot of that, involved in broadcast, but it was, I don't know, I think I just wanted to be a writer, and it felt like the natural way for me to go. Yeah.
When you sign up for one of these long-term total immersion kinds of stories, like the one in Concord with the family with the cancer, what kind of preparation do you do, both before you actually start the reporting and as you're going along?
I don't think I knew what I was signing up for with that story, honestly, but and so the preparation kind of happened. I feel like in any of the longer projects I've done, it's been sort of that's been very integrated with the process. It wasn't sort of done at the beginning, but what I'll say is that if you do have time before or definitely during the reporting process, you kind of have to just be prepared to get to know the story from every possible angle. So, I would say for me, it's been about interviewing everyone who sort of touches the story, and a lot of those people aren't ever in the narrative, but I guess it's been trying to think of it beyond what's just the narrative line that ends up in the story. I don't know. It's hard because I don't feel like I've done that conscientious preparation. I'll say one other thing about that though is to try to look at what's been done before, to read other people's work that's similar, and both so that you can try to do it differently, and also so that you can see what works and how they've done it. So reading about, I know that like when I was working on that story, I read and looked at the photos for the this is going back a little ways. The Sacramento Bee is anyone remembering the Pulitzer story that won there, of the boy who was dying and his mother? It was like 2 years, I think, before Preston. I'm not going to remember it, I'm sorry, but just to look at examples of other work that is similar. I don't know.
In this rapidly changing environment, for you, what do you see as your biggest challenges as a journalist to succeed in what's happening to the newspaper industry?
The biggest challenge, I think that my biggest day-to-day challenges are twofold, I guess. One, keeping up with it all. I blog and I, manage certain social media tools, and I write regularly for the paper, and I try to think about bigger picture stories, and I feel like my attention is sort of fragmented, and it's harder to do well at all of those things. I feel like I have to work extra hard to do well at each of those. Where in past jobs, really the thing that I've had to worry about is building a beat and writing that day's story. So that's kind of a small scale thing in the sense of like how do you be successful? You have to do well at the job that you do, and now the job involves much more than it used to.
Do you find that like at 10 o'clock at night you're on Facebook and interacting,
Yeah.
or is it's like one of those things where
Like
the notion of a 9-to-5 job no longer exists?
Yeah, definitely. but I think that part of it is that you have to figure out how to make that work for you. And I don't mean make I mean set up boundaries for yourself. I'll be checking my Twitter feed from bed on my smartphone and being like, it's actually going to be better for me to get a good night's sleep. And then the other thing I'd say is, I lost my train of thought. Successes. So fractured and figuring out how to do meaningful work. There's a lot of small things you have to do now. Like the blog is sort of a lot of chunks of news that go out quickly, and I want to have time in my schedule to be thoughtful about what I do. And so when you're kind of like on the constant churn, how do you then step off that treadmill and think about how to just do things differently?
I may have missed this because I came in a little bit late, but I was just curious more about how the White Coat Notes blog came about, because I think there's a great opportunity for journalists to kind of pitch ideas for blogs at bigger newspapers or magazines, just to have online content. So what was that process like for you?
I didn't pitch this blog. It actually was there beforehand, but I do agree with you that there's a lot of opportunity for that. And I think that I actually think that would be like a great thing to think about in job interviews. Like if you are interviewing at a publication and you think you could bring a blog to them, to really like think it out and maybe even write some practice posts and include that in your package or talk about it when you walk in to meet with them. I think you're right that opportunity is huge. The White Coat Notes blog, which I didn't pick the name either, but like it's very hard to say. It's been around for a little while. It was like one of the Globe's earlier blogs, I think, because it's been around for a few years at least. However, in my case, I stepped into it being a certain thing, and I've been talking with my editor to try to make it more of my own, to try to find ways to do things differently and to use my skills, in that format. And so for me, that's just been about brainstorming, and I have an editor who's open to that stuff. So it's and thoughtful brainstorming, to really think through what you want it to be and have a good concrete idea. What I don't think is good is to sort of just say I want to start a blog. It has to have a point and sort of a focus.
First off, just a comment. I visited a couple classes of mine, and I know others, and thanks for that. I think there's a lot of great conversations and information and instruction sharing about fundamentals of interviewing and finding sources and finding stories. And in the editing class, you made the point that that students and young journalists need to be their own best editor, and that in something like the White Coat Notes, that's literally true because you might be your only editor. Do you have any practical advice on how to apply sort of the standards of the deeper reporting that you've done at sort of light speed of a blog, where you have minutes maybe to report and verify and publish? You did practical tips or just thoughts on that, how to maintain that integrity of the reporting?
Yeah. So you're saying standards, so the integrity
Sort of
question
things,
versus...
tricks you do on deadline.
Yeah.
Kind of,
Yeah, so we talked about them a little bit in the editing class, but there are times when there might be another set of eyes on what I write before it goes online, but I know that person also is really strapped for time, and she might spend just about 5 minutes looking at it, and I know that that's not enough time to really have been thorough, so it makes me nervous. But I think that one thing to do is sort of to just really like take a moment to pause, to get up and walk away from your desk and go fill up your water bottle and come back and look at it again. And you're not going to be fresh, but maybe that moment of rest in between will give you a chance to look at it anew. And then at like a kind of more granular level, if it's something that you are concerned about and you have time, print it out and do a fact-checking thing just like you would on a longer piece. Fact-check it, you highlight things and cross them out and go through it with a fine comb tooth the way you would on those 3,000-word stories. And integrity-wise, I think the biggest thing is to not ever think of what you're doing on a blog or online or in shorter news stories as anything less than the full journalism that you do in the stories that you have a longer time to report. I think, the story I told sort of at the end of, there's this kind of pressure to be a content producer rather than a journalist to churn things out, and I just really reject that idea. I think it's bad for me as a professional, and it's bad for journalism if we think about ourselves that way. And so, in the integrity question, I think, that's sort of it. Like hold yourself to the same standards that you learn now in whatever job you take in journalism. Know those standards and keep yourself to them.
When you were doing your big narrative story, were you still performing all your daily tasks at the monitor too? Or
Yeah.
kind of more time consuming? Or?
Yeah, I for the most part I was. For the most part I had a beat to cover that whole time, and so I was doing daily reporting. There was some ebb and flow there, though. There were months that went by when I would maybe go to see the family every week, but I would maybe call Rich, the husband, twice in a week. And then there were periods, around like the holidays or towards the end of Carolyn's life, when I was there. The last 2 weeks, I think I was probably there just about every day, and Preston and I, especially in the last week, wanted someone to be there all the time. So at that time, we weren't doing daily work, and there were points when I had to talk to my editor about that and say, I can't do it. I remember that I had an assignment to do on the day of Carolyn's funeral, and I couldn't do it, and my editor was fine. He totally understood, and so there's real ebb and flow. But with these projects, especially at newspapers, you don't get a year and a half to focus on it entirely. So you have to. At one point this week, I was talking about you have to learn to work on multiple tracks. You sort of have your daily track, and you're doing everything that you need to do to keep, do your job and keep your editor happy, and then you're trying to carve out 20 minutes or an hour or maybe more than that on some days to work on the things that are longer and, need your attention over time.
Again, on that story, you worked with the family for months. You must have gotten emotionally involved yourself to some extent.
Yeah.
How did you manage that aspect of it? How did you manage to step back from that, write the story, do what you had to do?
I feel we've talked a bit about this in classes this week. I really feel like the emotions that you feel in these kinds of stories are important, and they're what makes stories like this good ultimately. When a reporter can acknowledge sort of how they feel about their subject. I didn't ever. There was never really a situation where I had to put my foot down with them. This family was really like aware of sort of what we were doing and seemed to get it. So like I never had to say, no, I can't give your son a ride, or, you know, those kind of like obvious things, which was great. And I think that in terms of how to be sure that my writing had the integrity I wanted it to have, Preston and I talked, the photographer and I talked about this a lot, and we talked about how we were feeling a lot, and I think the key is to know how you're feeling and to like recognize it and kind of like call it what it is, and to then you have the capacity to make sure that you're not letting that influence how you portray the reality of what happened. That was especially hard after Carolyn died, because, well, for one thing, I felt like I was grieving her, and so that was an interesting thing. But also our kind of stories and our mission was less clear. Like, you know, when you're telling the stories up until the point that she dies, there's like an end point, and you know the journey that you're on, and then afterward, like, I was grieving her, and I was watching Rich make some choices that maybe weren't the best for the family, and that other family members were frustrated with, and it was like a dark hole sometimes, you know, to go to the house, and it was, you know, at that point, like I felt like it was harder, and Preston and I just had to kind of like, we're great partners in that way, that we you know, helped each other to work it out, I think. Yeah. So. Thank you all. Thank you for coming.